Just this past month, I stumbled into a crazy scene I thought your listeners would like to hear about. The end of last year, my company moved me to one of their smaller satellite offices in Minnesota. Before moving here, I had been working at the Atlanta branch since I started with the company. I've been a Southern boy from birth, and me in the cold never got along. As you can imagine, the second I stepped out of the airport, I was freezing my tail off. I couldn't believe anyone wanted to be outside in this weather and any longer than they had to be. When I arrived at the tail end of winter last year and was confronted with hordes of men with facial hair that had icicles hanging from it, and they acted like it was no big deal, I thought had been transferred to Siberia by mistake. The morning this went down was November 11th. It was the coldest day we had so far, and it just happened to be the day my car wouldn't start. The office is only located about 1.5 miles from my apartment, so I could walk it relatively fast. If I was still in Atlanta, that journey would have been no problem. But this was Minnesota, and the temperature was well below freezing. Before I set off, I called the office and asked if anyone was there who could pick me up, but there wasn't. I told them my predicament, and they nonchalantly suggested I just walked since it was a warm day. I couldn't speak for a moment. Warm? I thought warm is 80 degrees. Arguing would have been pointless. So I hung up and prepared for a miserable walk to work. Once I was sure I had enough layers on, I headed out the door. I could only imagine how stupid I must have looked to the natives wrapped up like a mummy from head to toe. But by God, I was freezing. Really, all I could do was put my head down and embrace the suck. And that's what I did. I had gotten about half a mile into my trip when I glanced over to a parking lot just to the right of me and noticed the bundle of clothes at the corner of an abandoned business. My curiosity got the best of me, and I walked over to see what it was. That was a few feet away before I realized there was a person, and then I got scared. I've never seen a dead body before, and this person likely was in this cold. Just to be sure, I timidly approached the body and rolled it over. I was shocked to see it was a woman. Then she had been beaten badly about the head and face. I touched her skin, and as I feared, she was ice cold. Maybe because of what I'd seen on hundreds of movies and TV shows, I thought let's leave checked her pulse. Amazingly, there was one. It was very faint, but it was there. I checked again, just to be sure, and I was right. I quickly pulled my phone out and called 911. I assumed because we were so close to the police station, they were able to respond so fast. The paramedics scooped her up and took off, leaving me to speak to the police. After I explained the situation, they were kind enough to drop me off at the office. I was about an hour late. But after I told everyone what happened, I became the hero of the office. Even though all the attention embarrassed me a little, it did feel good to have everyone's respect. When you're the new guy and nobody knows you, that takes a while to achieve. Before I walked out of the office that afternoon, I called the hospital to see how the woman was doing. It took a few minutes to get a hold of the person that knew what I was talking about. But when I found out that she had survived and was doing well. Even the nurse I spoke to was amazed that she pulled through. She told me that she sees a handful of exposure cases every year, and the overwhelming majority is bad office hurt and survive. Later in the same week, she became conscious enough to tell the police how she ended up in that parking lot. She claimed that she had been waiting for a friend and she had been attacked from behind. But when I spoke to one of the officers involved with the case, he told me he believed she had been with a customer in his car. And he had beaten her up and kicked her out of the car, probably leaving her for dead. She had 1 or 2 arrests previously in her past, so he believed that to be most likely the same scenario. All of this was off the record, of course, like I was a reporter or something. Personally, I don't care how the poor woman makes ends meet. I'm just happy she's alive, and I hope she makes a full recovery and time to get back to her fan. Way for the holidays. Winter is long and cold up here, but fun nonetheless. As a child, I would stay outside all day playing in the snow, and then have to soak my hands in warm water for 10 minutes just to get the feeling back in them. Stupid or not, those were the best times of my life. However, the winter I was in 5th grade, something horrible would be set in motion in my town. School would just let out for Christmas break when the first body was found. His name was Mike Keller, and he was a 2nd grader from Mount Vernon. And the reports in the news said that he had been beaten severely, but he also had multiple stab wounds that were determined to be the cause of death. I can't say that the murder caused an uproar. That would come later, but it certainly got folks' attention. It didn't put a dent in my thick head. If my mom mentioned it to me, I don't recall it. My usual life continued unabated. Day after day, I would spend my time playing in the snow, only taking breaks to eat some play Minecraft. Things didn't really ramp up until another kid was found. This one turned out to be from my neck of the woods. The police reports echoed that of the previous murder. Although the stab wounds were far more numerous than on the body of Color. Now was when the parents county-wide started taking the threat more seriously. I'm sure every kid got the same speech I did. Warning of the dangers of talking to people you didn't know. When everyone would discover the truth behind the murders, it would be much more horrible than they expected. If any kid paid attention to the parents' warnings, I wasn't one of them. My mom's words went in one ear and out the other. Since the snow had long melted after Christmas Day, I had plans to meet up with friends at our hand-built forts in the woods. But when I got there, the only people around were 2 kids I didn't know very well. One was a 7th grader, and the other was a year behind me. He went to the same school as I did. And the rumor was that he had been held back twice. From the looks of him, the rumors were true. Despite only being slightly taller than me, he was already showing signs of a mustache. When it comes to the older kids, I didn't know much about him other than he had a reputation for being mean to younger kids. So the second I saw him, I got very nervous. The 2 of them, whose names I'm not going to mention here for the reason you will soon see, were acting like they were my best friends despite never talking to me before. When the older boy asked me if my friends were on the way, I foolishly told the truth. If they weren't already at the fort, they probably wouldn't be coming. This must have been the answer they were hoping for. Because as soon as I said it, they began their attack. The older boy's sucker punched me to the ground. I came very close to passing out. Now I know if I had, I would have been number 3 on their hit list, but somehow I stayed awake. I use a nearby tree to get to my feet just in time to see the younger kid pull a folding knife from his pocket. The older kid was swinging the wooden bat around. When they saw me stand up, the older boy ran up to me and swung for my head. I ducked, but he was close enough to rip a lock of hair out when the bat hit the tree above me. I figured the kid with a knife was coming after me next. So I booked it down to there. My legs were still a little rubbery, but I knew if I stopped, I was dead. The older kid was right on my heels, and my lungs were burning terribly. However, I was fortunate to live on the edge of the woods and made it inside my house before they caught up with me. I ran into my mom and I breathlessly tried to explain what had just happened. She understood enough to be upset and yelled for my dad to call the police. My mom quickly explained the situation to him and he related to the dispatcher. The police came quick and I told them what had happened and who did it. They had no problem finding the boys. They must have known it was over for them and they both went home and waited. The brutality of the murders was taken into consideration and it was decided to keep them in custody until their trials. Naturally, the DA wanted to try them as adults, but they were just a bit too young. Since each boy was blaming the other, despite both being responsible, they were trying separately. Neither showed any remorse and as a result they were given life for each murder and 15 to 25 for the attempt on my life. Had this happened just a few years earlier, they both would have been likely given life without parole for each murder charge. Recent legislation states that an offender cannot be given such a sentence if they committed their crime as a youthful offender. Ultimately, the legislation mattered not. Both boys were transferred to the adult system at 21. And because of crimes they committed inside, they probably won't ever get out. And that's the way that I like it. It was glaringly obvious to everyone around at that time that they weren't right in the head. It's just terrible. The two young boys and almost me had to lose their lives before something was done about it. I'd taken my yearly journey to the woods to hunt since I was 14. Last year started just as every other one before had. We would end much earlier in a very different way than usual. Despite the weather being too warm for hunting, I was out at dawn on opening day like always. As the season drags on, the deer get more skittish. So starting as early as you can increase your chances on the land I've been hunting on for the past 7 years. I had a small handful of preferred spots. And this is where I was heading. This spot was a tree stand setting roughly 30 feet high and an old oak that looked down across one of 3 feet plots. I had good luck there and more than once and hope to have it again. The drive out to the stand took about 15 minutes from my cabin. So I left an hour before dawn. I wanted to be on the stand just as the first bit of light broke. As usual, I parked my four-wheeler about 50 yards away and walked through the rest of the way in. I'm not sure if it makes any real difference, but not making a bunch of noise right next to where I'd be hunting seems like a wise idea. So it's a practice I try to remember to do each time I hunt. Although I'd been up over an hour and had a couple of cups of coffee, I was probably a little groggy. I've never been a mornings type of guy. And once I retired, I've gotten up when I woke up, no certain time. So I slung my rifle onto my back and began to climb. About 3 steps from the top with the seat in sight, one of my feet slipped from the ladder and I fell about 25 feet on my back. Somehow my rifle ended up next to me rather than under. There was no pain at first, so I figured I'd just get up and dust myself off. However, I discovered very quickly that at least one, if not both legs were broken. As I set up to examine my legs, pain began shooting through my back and body and appeared then in addition to broken legs, I had a major back injury. My usual high pain tolerance was letting me down, and the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. I knew in a matter of minutes, I was going to be screaming in pain. I began feeling for my phone and soon found it my chest pocket. Luckily, I didn't land on my chest right. Being out in the middle of nowhere didn't necessarily mean there wouldn't be any cell service. In my neck of the woods, cell towers are more common than trees. I dialed 911 and waited, but the call dropped. The pain was making me very nauseous, and I was having a hard time concentrating. It took me a moment to realize I was going to need to move if I had a chance of getting help. I couldn't think of any other way, so I gritted my teeth and rolled over onto my stomach. The pain very nearly caused me to pass out, but the star soon passed, and then began pulling myself forward with my arms. I made it around 15 yards before I was forced to take a break. Once I had pulled myself together, I tried to call 911 again, but it was a no-go. I looked around and noticed I was still under the trees. But there was a clearing not far away. I gritted my teeth again, hold myself toward it. I had to take a couple of breaks, but eventually I was in the open. I crossed my fingers and pressed send the way it was agonizing. But it finally began ringing and I was connected to a dispatcher. The pain made the wait for help to arrive seem even longer. But because of my location and clear directions, they made it to me within 30 minutes. As I laid there, I watched the sunrise, thinking how beautiful a scene it was to see. I only wished it was under better circumstances. By the time I was released from the hospital a few days later, I would have 2 broken legs and a broken back, which really was crushed vertebrae. The legs would just have to heal with time, but with my back, I've had to have a couple of those vertebrae fused. The surgery was done just a few months before this year's hunting season started, and you can be sure I was there, waiting for the sun to rise on the first morning. One thing has changed. However, the time being, I'll be hunting from a blind on the ground. There's no way I'm going to go another year with an empty freezer. The arrival of cold weather is a thing I can look forward to every year. However, this season has carried with it a tinge of pain for the last few years, because it was about this time in 2014 when I lost the love of my life and a horrible car accident, Melissa, and I had met during my second year of college. She was here behind me and would often seek me out when she had questions regarding her classes. I finally told her more in a joking way than anything, that if I was going to keep helping her with schoolwork that she was going to owe me a date. To my surprise and joy she agreed, and we were soon living together. We had her shares of ups and downs for the next few years, but managed to stick it out until graduation. Once we were both out of school, we made the next step and were married the following June. We weren't in a hurry to have any kids. And we both had new jobs and lacked the security we would gain with time. When the time did come, we proudly announced the impending arrival of our first child, a boy, just days after our third anniversary. On the last week of March 2011, Jason Jr. came into our lives kicking and screaming, and I've never been happier. As you can imagine, life was hectic for a while. Not until 2013 did we have the energy to go for one more, which we decided that the time would likely be our last. Having more wasn't out of the question in the future. But for now, it seemed wise. It didn't take long before we had a new one on the way. Another boy, according to the doctors. The news of another boy on the way had me elated, but I couldn't help feeling that my life was going too well. Despite my misgivings, I went ahead into life with both feet. After an especially grueling summer, the arrival of fall was a welcome change. Halloween was fine and Thanksgiving was the perfect excuse to gorge on food I wouldn't usually eat the rest of the year. We did decide to skip the Black Friday sales, choosing rather to begin our Christmas shopping the day after. The carnage involved has always struck me as stupid. So I put it off as long as I dare each year. Melissa thought it may be less hectic if we left Jason Jr. with his grandparents, and I agreed they would surely love to spend some time with him, and we will be able to blow through the stores much quicker if it was just the two of us. I'm sure she added the last part for my sake. She was well aware of how much I hated holiday shopping. The night prior had been a hard freeze, and many sections of the road were dangerously slick because of the 8 holes that left their sprinklers on. I was very aware of the danger that this posed and drove us defensively as possible. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Melissa and I were discussing something. So I didn't see this big patch of ice at the curb ahead of us. We had just exited off the highway. So we were still going pretty fast. Just a little way down the road was a curve, and one side of that curve dropped off about 65 feet, almost straight down. I knew it was there, but it wasn't paying attention. The area going into and out of the curve was a giant sheet of ice, and I didn't see it at the time. When I did, rather than just let off the gas, I reflexively tapped on the brake. I estimate we were still going around 45 miles an hour when we hit it. Because of my stupid driving, we slid quickly sideways, hit the curb, and flipped down the hill, spinning the whole time. Since I didn't have my seatbelt on, I was thrown from the car, which was a 2000 for a Suzu Rodeo, and knocked out, and still unaware of how long I was unconscious, but it couldn't have been long. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was at the top of the hill. I strained to turn my head to see where the car had stopped and eventually caught sight of it laying upside down at the bottom of the hill. The roof had been crushed flat with the body, and I couldn't see Melissa moving. I hoped at the time that she had also been thrown survive, but she had not. To make things more horrific, the rodeo caught fire a few minutes later, and there was nothing I could do but lay there with a broken body. Watch my wife and future child burner. Possibly even alive for all I knew. All I could do was sob uncontrollably until I passed out again. I wouldn't regain consciousness completely until that night. The pain I was feeling could only be matched by the grief I was feeling from the loss of my wife and child. I called for the nurse, and she came in and showed me how to work my morphine pump. And so I was aware of it. I found myself pushing the button often. Around midday the following day, I spoke to the doctors and then the police. The doctors informed me that I had broken both of my legs, 3 vertebrae, and had a concussion, among many other injuries. Needless to say, I was going to have a long, hard road ahead of me. The police had even more bad news to share. I hadn't bothered to ask about Melissa's condition. I knew if she would have made it, somebody would have said something. My hopes that she had been thrown free of the car was shot down. The only positive thing, which I really can't call positive, was that she and the child had died on impact with the ground. I attempted to soothe myself, the knowledge that they at least hadn't burned alive. But it proved to be cold comfort. Jason Jr. stayed with my folks during my holiday stay. And once I was released, they stayed with me a while to help me until I could function on my own. I'm not going to say much about the funeral. It's still too painful a thing to recall. Since that time, I've undergone 2 back surgeries and foresee at least 1 more in the future. I was ruled to be disabled by Social Security and now live off the benefits I receive. I'm also able to make a little on the side doing tax consulting. So Jason Jr. and I get by okay. Jason Jr. was still too young to really remember his mother. However, now that he's at that age, to be aware of her absence. I tell them all I can about her. Make sure he knows how much she loved him. And maybe in a few years, I'll tell him about his little brother too. Every day, I'm reminded of how much I lost that day. But then I realized how much I have gained. My time with her may have been brief, but every moment of it was great. We created a beautiful and bright boy together. I'd say we did pretty good. I think Jason Jr. and I are we're gonna be alright. This happened my dad back in the 60s when he was a kid. He grew up with a brother and his parents in the rural part of Michigan. I had asked him once or twice about his younger brother when I discovered he'd had one. This is the story he told me of why he was missing from our lives. This is in his words, more or less. We were the example of hicks when I was growing up. My great-grandparents had come over from Sweden back in the 1800s. And nobody had left the farm since then, except to fight in Europe. Our lives depended on the weather and what the land could provide for us. We didn't even get electricity until I was 8 years old. We did have automobiles, but they were usually old and worn out by the time they got to us, put together with baling wire and stuff like that. Well, my little brother Bill and I went out one morning, I think it was early February, to go hunt some rabbits for the pot. That should give you an idea of how poor we were back then. But Bill and me, we didn't know any better. We never had to be asked twice to go hunting. That morning was incredibly cold and then snowed 2 or 3 inches overnight. I had on almost every bit of clothing I owned, and so did Bill. It was about 9 before we left the house. We were headed to the woods that sat across the lake. The woods took up about 30 acres of our 50, and it was chock full again, big and small. I was carrying the .410 and Bill had the .22. Both of us had our pockets over full with extra ammo. Ammo was one of those things even poor folks had a lot of. Back then we were kind of in a hurry because we got started later than normal, and that wasn't paying as close attention as I should have been. Between sunup and when we left, it had probably warmed up about at least 20 degrees. We hadn't made it 100 yards before we turned back to shed some layers. Mama, you helped us to stop fooling around and get to hunting, so my mind was on getting to the woods as fast as possible. It took us about 10 minutes to reach the lake. The layer of snow on the top of the ice had already melted, leaving the ice slicker than normal. Under normal circumstances, we would have stepped lightly as we cross so it's not to end up on our butts. But this morning, we were running late. And I slipped a couple of times, and Bill, who was behind me a few steps, had to hold on to my coat to stay upright on a few occasions. I could see tracks leading into the trees as we got close, and my pace began to pick up. It was about 20 yards from the end of the ice when I heard a loud bang, quickly followed by a splash. I looked back to check on Bill, only to see that he disappeared. I saw that a hole had broken through the ice roughly 2 feet across. It was clear what had happened. So I did something that probably wasn't very wise and threw myself onto the ice. I jammed my arms into the hole, reaching all around it, feeling for one of Bill's hands or arms. It didn't take but less than a minute for my arms to start screaming and pain from the cold water. I began panicking because I knew every second he was in that ice-cold water he was less likely to come out. I didn't want to take my arm out of the water, but I knew I couldn't stand the pain one moment more. I started the hole, hoping to see Bill pop out of it while I rubbed the feeling back into my arms. I was just about to give up when I got the idea to break off a long tree limb and stick it down in the hole. I found one. It took me a few seconds to break it. But once I ran back to the hole and stuck it into the water. I'd switch sides of the hole every few seconds, hoping I'd feel him grabbed onto the stick. I carried on with this for a couple of minutes until I realized it was pointless. There was nothing else I could do but run home and ask my papa for help. I still had that last shred of hope that he would find a way to save him. But when I ran into the house and told them what happened, his face said it all. Seeing that expression on his face stripped me of that last shred, and I collapsed on the floor and bawled like I never had before. It only got worse when Mama came in the room and Papa gave her the news. Her wailing only made my sadness and guilt. Yes, guilt that much worse. At some point that day, I began to get an idea in my head that my folks may blame me for Bill's death. They both told me more than once that my job was to protect my little brother, and I had screwed it up. After crying myself to sleep that night. The next morning, I was terrified to leave my room. I wasn't sure what was going to happen to me. All kinds of ideas were swirling around in my head. At one point, I even convinced myself that they'd give me away to an orphanage for being such an awful son. It took my folks a few hours to convince me to come out, and only did when they promised that they weren't mad at me. That didn't stop me from apologizing when I saw them. They said it was just a terrible accident. And nobody was to blame. We all broke down after that and held each other and cried for a long time. That scene would be played out a bunch of times over the next few weeks. The thing that made things more painful, perhaps, was the wait for the leg to thaw before we could find Bill's body and bury it. Finally, around the last week of April, had warmed up enough to retrieve his body from the lake and have the funeral. Mama and me cried most that day. It wasn't until around the time you were born that the two of us were talking and thinking back to those days. That Mama admitted to me that she felt guilty since she'd sent us out that morning, told us to hurry. We both came to the conclusion that moment neither of us were truly at fault. It was nothing more than an accident we were helpless to prevent, to tell the truth. On any other February day, that lake would have been frozen 3 feet down and hard as a rock. It just happened. It was one of those once-in-a-lifetime days, wasn't? I can't speak for Mama. But that day was when I was finally able to let go of all my guilt once and for all. Well, JR, that's most of it that I can remember. File that away in your mind somewhere safe, because I didn't tell him ever again. And those were the words that he told me. And I was at a loss for words. I'd never in my life heard my dad be so open about his life and upbringing. I known he'd been pretty poor, but that was it. In the silence, he drifted off somewhere into his past. Now unaware of my presence, dredging up all of that grief had turned his eyes red and filled them with tears. I decided I slipped quietly out of the room to leave him alone with his memories. My dad and I had our share of clashes and have often went long periods not speaking to one another. But after hearing that story, I was able to see him in a bit of a more positive light. I realized now, even someone who's hard as a rock like him can hurt deep down. I realize he's as human as the rest of us.